Welcome to Angular Top 100 Questions and Answers, your 2026 interview study guide made by Sin. What is Angular? Angular is a full-featured web framework for building client-side applications. It gives you a structured way to build apps with components, templates, routing, dependency injection, forms, HTTP, and tooling from the Angular CLI. In current Angular, the official docs emphasize fast, reliable apps and modern features such as signals, server-side rendering, or SSR and hydration. What is a component in Angular? A component is the main building block of an Angular UI. Each component combines a TypeScript class, an HTML template, and optional styles. Angular renders components into the DOM and composes applications by nesting components together. What are standalone components? Standalone components are components that can be used without being declared in an ng module. They list the directives, pipes, and other dependencies they need directly in their imports, which reduces boilerplate and simplifies composition. Standalone APIs are the preferred direction for new Angular code. Are ng modules still relevant in modern Angular? Yes, ng modules are still supported and remain important in many existing codebases and some library scenarios. However, Angular recommends standalone bootstrapping for new code, so ng modules are no longer the default architectural starting point for new applications. What is a directive in Angular? A directive is a class that adds behavior to elements in a template. Angular uses directives for common tasks, such as controlling rendering, reacting to events, and attaching reusable behavior. Components are a specialized kind of directive that also have a template. What is the difference between a component and a directive? A component is a directive with its own template and view. A regular directive changes behavior or appearance on an existing host element, while a component defines a view that Angular renders. So every component is a directive, but not every directive is a component. What are pipes in Angular? Pipes transform values in templates in a declarative way. They are useful for formatting dates, numbers, currencies, text, and async values without moving display logic into the template body. You can use built-in pipes or create custom pipes. What is the difference between pure and impure pipes? Pure pipes run only when Angular detects a pure change to an input reference or primitive value. Impure pipes run during every change detection cycle, so they are more flexible, but also more expensive. Pure pipes are the default and are usually the better choice for performance. What is interpolation in Angular? Interpolation is the open-close double curly braces syntax used to render component values as text in a template. Angular evaluates the expression and keeps the rendered text synchronized with component state during change detection. What is property binding? Property binding uses square brackets, such as left bracket disabled right bracket or left bracket value right bracket, to set a DOM property, directive input, or component input from component state. It creates one-way data flow from the component class into the template target. What is event binding? Event binding uses parentheses, such as open parentheses, click close parentheses, to listen for events raised by DOM elements, directives, or components. When the event fires, Angular runs the expression or method you specified. What is two-way binding? Two-way binding combines property binding and event binding, so a value flows into a control and updates can flow back out. Its shorthand syntax is open bracket, open parentheses, close bracket. This pattern is common with form controls and model-style component APIs. What is the modern control flow syntax in Angular? Modern Angular templates support built-in control flow blocks such as at, if, at, for, and at switch. These blocks replace much of the older micro-syntax-heavy style and make templates easier to read and reason about. Why is tracking important in at-for loops? Tracking gives Angular a stable identity for each item rendered by at-for. That lets Angular reuse existing DOM nodes instead of recreating them unnecessarily, which improves performance and reduces UI churn. In interviews, this is often discussed as the modern equivalent of using track-by well. What is content projection in Angular? Content projection lets a component render content that is provided by its parent. Angular uses n-jane content as a placeholder, which is useful for building wrappers, cards, dialogues, and reusable layout components. What is the purpose of ng-template? ng-template defines a template fragment that Angular can instantiate later. It does not render visible DOM by itself until Angular uses it through a structural directive, a template outlet, or programmatic rendering. What is ng-container? ng-container groups template content without adding an extra real DOM element. It is useful when you want to apply structural behavior or organize template markup while keeping the DOM clean. What are template reference variables? A template reference variable gives you a local handle to a DOM element, component, directive, or template ref within a template. They are often used for direct template access, form references, and view queries. What are inputs in Angular? Inputs let a parent pass data into a child component or directive. In modern Angular, you can declare them with APIs such as input function, and Angular also supports decorator-based inputs for existing code. Inputs are the standard way to configure reusable components from the outside. What are outputs in Angular? Outputs let a component or directive emit events to its parent. In modern Angular, you can declare them with output function, and parents subscribe with template event bindings such as open parenthesis stack saved close parenthesis. They are commonly used for child-to-parent communication. How do parent and child components communicate? The usual pattern is that the parent passes data down through inputs and the child emits events up through outputs. For more complex cases, both components can coordinate through shared services or router state, but inputs and outputs are the first choice for a direct relationship. What is a service in Angular? A service is a class that holds reusable logic or shared state that should not live inside a component template class. Services are commonly used for business logic, HTTP access, caching, logging, and cross-component coordination. Angular's DI system makes services easy to provide and reuse. What is dependency injection in Angular? Dependency injection is the mechanism Angular uses to create and supply dependencies, such as services to components, directives, pipes, and other services. It improves modularity, testability, and separation of concerns, because classes request what they need instead of constructing it directly. What is a hierarchical injector? Angular's dependency injection system is hierarchical, meaning injectors are arranged in a tree that mirrors application structure. When Angular resolves a dependency, it starts at the current injector and walks upward until it finds a provider. This makes service visibility and scoping very flexible. What is the inject function and when is it used? The inject function is a modern Angular API for retrieving a dependency from the current injection context. It is commonly used in standalone style code, functional guards, interceptors, and class fields where constructor injection would be more verbose or less ergonomic. What does provided en route mean? It means Angular should provide a single application-wide instance of that injectable in the root injector. This is the common way to register singleton services, and it works well with tree shaking for unused services. What are signals in Angular? Signals are Angular's fine-grained reactive primitive for state. A signal wraps a value, tracks where it is read, and lets Angular update only the parts of the UI that depend on it. They are now a major part of modern Angular application design. What is a computed signal? A computed signal derives a value from one or more other signals. Angular recalculates it when any dependency changes, so it is useful for derived state without manual synchronization code. What is an effect in Angular? An effect runs side-effectful code in response to signal changes. It is useful for integrating signal state with logging, local storage, imperative APIs, or other external systems. It is not the first choice for deriving state. Computed is usually better for that. What is an observable? An observable represents a stream of values over time. Angular uses observables heavily for HTTP, router events, forms, and many asynchronous workflows. They are especially useful when you need cancellation, composition, or multiple emissions instead of a single eventual value. What is the async pipe and why is it useful? A sync pipe subscribes to a promise or observable and returns the latest emitted value to the template. It also marks the view for checking and automatically unsubscribes when the component is destroyed or the source reference changes. That reduces manual subscription code and helps prevent leaks. What is change detection in Angular? Change detection is the process Angular uses to keep rendered templates in sync with application state. When Angular runs change detection, it evaluates bindings and updates the DOM where values changed. Modern Angular pairs this with signals, onPush, and other optimizations to reduce unnecessary work. What is change detection strategy? onPush. onPush tells Angular to skip automatically checking a component subtree, unless that subtree is marked for checking by recognized triggers. This usually improves performance because unchanged parts of the UI are not rechecked as often. It pairs especially well with immutable data, signals, and careful state flow. What does zoneless Angular mean? Zoneless Angular means running change detection without relying on Zone.js to automatically schedule checks from browser tasks. Instead, Angular relies on its own reactive APIs and explicit notifications. This can reduce overhead and make app behavior easier to reason about, but components must follow compatible patterns. What are lifecycle hooks in Angular? Lifecycle hooks are callback points that Angular invokes at specific times during a component or directive's lifetime. They let you run code during initialization, input changes, content projection, view initialization, and destruction. What does ng on init do? ng on init runs once after Angular has initialized a component's inputs. It is commonly used for startup logic that depends on injected services or initial input values, though some newer patterns using signals need it less often. What does ng on changes do? ng on changes runs when Angular detects changes to a component's input properties. It is useful when logic must react specifically to input transitions, especially in decorator-based input code. In some modern signal-based patterns, computed in effect can replace part of this usage. What does ng after viewInit do? ng after viewInit runs once after Angular has fully initialized the component's own view. It is typically used when code needs access to view queries or to interact with rendered view children after they exist. What are viewChild and ContentChild used for? Queries such as viewChild and ContentChild let a component get references to things in its view or projected content. They are useful for accessing child components, directives, elements, or template refs when template references alone are not enough. What is view encapsulation? View encapsulation controls how a component's styles are scoped. Angular can emulate style scoping, use native shadow DOM, or disable encapsulation and treat styles as global. The choice affects CSS isolation, interoperability, and debugging. What is the difference between emulated shadow DOM and none-view encapsulation? Emulated is Angular's default style scoping approach and works without native shadow DOM. Shadow DOM uses the browser's shadow DOM for stronger style isolation. None disables encapsulation, so component styles behave like global CSS. What approaches does Angular support for forms? Angular supports reactive forms and template-driven forms. Reactive forms are model-driven and explicit, while template-driven forms rely more on template directives and are usually better for simpler forms. What is the difference between reactive forms and template-driven forms? Reactive forms are explicit, synchronous, and model-driven, which makes them more scalable, testable, and suitable for complex forms. Template-driven forms are simpler to start with and rely more on directives in the template, but they scale less well in large or highly dynamic forms. What are form control and form group? Form control represents a single form field and tracks its value, validation state, and interaction state. Form group is a collection of controls managed as a unit, which is useful for forms with multiple related inputs. What are strictly typed reactive forms? Strictly typed reactive forms give Angular forms stronger TypeScript types. This improves autocomplete, catches invalid property access at compile time, and reduces the amount of any like code around form values and controls. How does validation work in Angular forms? Angular validators return either null for valid input or an error object for invalid input. Validation can be synchronous or asynchronous, and Angular updates control state such as valid, invalid, touched, dirty, and pending accordingly. What are async validators? Async validators are validators that return a promise or observable instead of a result immediately. They're used when validation depends on asynchronous work, such as checking whether a username is already taken on a server. How do you create a custom validator in Angular? You create a custom validator by writing a function or directive that examines a control's value and returns either null or a validation arrow object. Custom validators are useful when built-in validators do not capture your business rules. What is the Angular router? The Angular router is the official library for navigation in Angular single-page applications. It maps URLs to routed components, supports guards and resolvers, and enables features such as lazy loading and nested routes. How do you define routes in Angular? Routes are defined as route objects that map a path or pattern to a component, lazy loaded component, redirect, or additional route behavior. In modern Angular, routes are commonly registered with provider header. What is router outlet? Router outlet marks where routed content should render. When navigation activates a route, Angular inserts the matching component into that outlet. What is the difference between routerlink and the router.navigate function? Routerlink is a template directive for declarative navigation from markup. The router.navigate function is an imperative API you call from TypeScript when navigation depends on code flow, conditions, or event handling logic. What is activated route used for? Activated route gives a routed component access to information about the currently active route. It is used to read route parameters, query parameters, route data, resolve data, and other route state. What are route guards? Route guards are functions that decide whether navigation can proceed, continue into children, leave a route, or even match a route at all. They are useful for authentication flows, feature flags, and unsaved change prompts. They improve client-side UX, but real authorization must still be enforced on the server. What is a route resolver? A resolver loads data before a route is activated. This is useful when a page depends on data that should already be available when the component renders, reducing loading logic inside the component itself. What is lazy loading in Angular routing? Lazy loading means Angular loads route code only when the user navigates to that route. This reduces the initial JavaScript bundle and improves startup performance, especially in larger applications. What is preloading in Angular routing? Preloading is the practice of loading lazy route bundles in the background before the user requests them. It helps reduce the weight on the first navigation to a lazy route while still keeping the initial load lighter than eager loading everything. What router events are commonly used in Angular? Angular router emits navigation lifecycle events such as navigation start, routes recognized, guards check start, resolve start, and navigation end. These events are useful for analytics, progress indicators, logging, and debugging navigation behavior. What is HTTP client? HTTP client is Angular's service for making HTTP requests. Its methods return RxJS observables, support typed responses, and integrate with interceptors and Angular's testing utilities. How do Angular HTTP interceptors work? Interceptors sit between your code and the HTTP backend. They can inspect or transform outgoing requests and incoming responses, which makes them useful for auth headers, logging, retries, caching, and consistent error handling. Modern Angular recommends functional interceptors for predictable behavior. How do you test HTTP requests in Angular? Angular provides a dedicated testing package that lets you capture outgoing HTTP requests, assert on them, and flush mock responses. This keeps your tests fast and isolated from real backends. How do you usually share state between unrelated Angular components? A common approach is to put shared state in an injected service. That service may expose state through signals, observables, or a subject-based API, depending on whether the use case is mostly local UI state or asynchronous event streams. When would you use signals versus RxJS observables in Angular? Signals are excellent for synchronous, fine-grained application or component state that drives rendering directly. Observables are better for asynchronous streams, event sources, HTTP, and complex reactive composition across time. In real apps, Angular Refun uses both together. What is a behavior subject, and why is it common in Angular apps? A behavior subject is a subject that requires an initial value and immediately emits its current value to new subscribers. It became a common Angular pattern for shared state because components can subscribe and always receive the latest value, even after the first emission. Today, some of those use cases are also handled very naturally with signals. Why is switch map commonly used in Angular? Switch map maps each source value to a new observable and switches to the latest one, unsubscribing from the previous inner stream. That makes it especially useful for searches, route-driven data loading, and HTTP requests where stale results should be abandoned when newer input arrives. How do you avoid memory leaks from subscriptions in Angular? You can avoid leaks by preferring async pipe and templates, cleaning up manual subscriptions in destroy logic, or using helpers that tie subscription lifetime to Angular's lifecycle. The goal is to ensure long-lived streams do not outlive the component or directive that created them. What does takeUntilDestroyed do? TakeUntilDestroyed is an Angular RxJS interop operator that completes an observable subscription when the current Angular context is destroyed. It reduces boilerplate and is a clean, modern way to manage subscription lifetimes in components, directives, and services. What is AOT compilation? Ahead-of-time compilation converts Angular templates and TypeScript into efficient JavaScript during the build. This can improve startup performance and catch template errors earlier because more work happens before the browser runs the app. What is the Angular CLI? Angular CLI is the command line toolchain for creating, generating, serving, building, testing, and updating Angular projects. It standardizes workflows and automates many tasks that would otherwise require manual configuration. What is the difference between ngserve and ngbuild? ngserve is for local development. It builds the app in dev mode, starts a dev server, and rebuilds on changes. ngbuild creates production or other configured output artifacts for deployment, optimization, server-side rendering, or SSR, or static hosting. What is Angular.json used for? Angular.json is the Angular workspace configuration file. It stores project-level settings for builders, targets, assets, styles, scripts, environments, and other defaults used by Angular CLI tooling. What is server-side rendering? Server-side rendering, or SSR, in Angular? Server-side rendering, or SSR, means Angular renders the initial HTML on the server, instead of waiting for the browser to build the first view entirely on the client. This can improve perceived load speed, search engine optimization, or SEO friendliness, and first render performance. What is hydration in Angular? Hydration is the process of attaching Angular's client-side behavior to server-rendered HTML instead of recreating the DOM from scratch. That lets Angular reuse existing DOM and continue from the server-rendered page more efficiently. What is incremental hydration? Incremental hydration extends the hydration model so parts of the page can hydrate later, instead of hydrating the entire application at once. This helps large server-side rendering or SSR apps reduce main thread work during startup and defer non-critical interactivity. What does the @defer block do? The @deal verblock creates a deferrable view that delays loading and rendering non-critical code until a trigger or condition is met. It can shrink the initial bundle and improve metrics like largest contentful paint or LCP, and time to first byte or TTFB by postponing less important work. What is NG Optimized Image? NG Optimized Image is Angular's image optimization directive. It helps with image loading best practices such as priority handling, lazy loading, pre-connect hints, SRAC generation, and better, largest contentful paint or LCP behavior. How does Angular help prevent cross-site scripting or XSS? Angular treats all values as untrusted by default and sanitizes them when binding into dangerous DOM contexts. This reduces the risk of cross-site scripting, especially around HTML, style URL, and resource URL syncs. Safe coding still matters, but Angular gives you strong built-in protection. What is DOM Sanitizer? DOM Sanitizer is Angular's service for sanitizing values for specific DOM security contexts. It helps prevent cross-site scripting or XSS by making sure values used in sensitive bindings are safe for that context. Bypass methods exist, but they should be used very carefully and only with trusted content. What is security context in Angular? Security context identifies the kind of DOM sync a value is being bound into, such as HTML, style, or URL. Angular uses the context to decide how sanitization should be applied, because different targets have different security rules. What is Testbed? Testbed is Angular's main unit testing utility for configuring an isolated Angular testing environment. It sets up dependency injection, compiles components, and gives tests a realistic Angular runtime context without booting the full app. How do you test Angular components? Component tests typically use Testbed to create a fixture, render the component, trigger change detection, and make assertions against DOM output or component state. For new Angular CLI projects, the default unit testing setup is now based on Vitis. How do you test Angular services? Service tests usually configure a test bed, inject the service under test, and replace external dependencies with spies, fakes, or mock providers. This keeps tests focused on service logic rather than UI behavior. How do you test routing and navigation in Angular? Routing tests verify that links, navigations, guards, and route-driven rendering behave as expected. Angular provides guidance and utilities for testing route changes, outlet rendering, and navigation-related behavior in isolation. What are component test harnesses? A component test harness is a supported API for interacting with a component in tests without coupling the test too tightly to implementation details. Harnesses make tests more maintainable because they express intent, such as clicking a control or reading its label, instead of raw DOM plumbing. When should you use Element Ref? Element Rear gives direct access to a host DOM element. You should use it sparingly, because direct DOM access is more brittle and less portable than Angular abstractions. It is acceptable when you genuinely need low-level DOM interaction, and there is no better Angular API for the job. When should you use Renderer 2? Renderer 2 is Angular's DOM abstraction for creating or updating rendered output without directly reaching into the browser DOM API. It is useful when you need imperative rendering behavior, but still want an abstraction layer that better supports non-DOM renderers and platform concerns. What are host bindings and host listeners? Host bindings and host listeners let a directive or component interact with its own host element. They are used to bind host properties, attributes, classes, styles, and to handle host events. Current Angular guidance also encourages using the host metadata object where appropriate. How do you render a component dynamically in Angular? Angular supports dynamic rendering either declaratively with ngComponentOutlet or imperatively with ViewContainerRef. This is useful for plugin systems, dynamic dashboards, dialogues, CMS-like layouts, and conditional component composition. What does Bootstrap application do? Bootstrap application starts an Angular application using a standalone root component. It is the modern bootstrapping API and is the recommended approach for new Angular applications. What is the difference between Bootstrap application and Bootstrap module? Bootstrap application starts a standalone app from a standalone root component. Bootstrap module starts an ng module-based application from a root module. Angular recommends Bootstrap application for new code, while Bootstrap module remains relevant for module-based apps. What does ng update do? ng update helps move Angular projects to newer versions by applying dependency updates and automated migrations. This is one of the reasons Angular upgrades are usually more manageable than hand-editing every breaking change yourself. What is Angular DevTools? Angular DevTools is a browser extension for debugging and profiling Angular applications. It provides features such as a component tree inspector, dependency injection visibility, and performance profiling to help diagnose rendering and change detection issues. What is template type checking in Angular? Template type checking is Angular's compile time analysis of template expressions and bindings. It catches many mistakes early, such as invalid property access, incompatible input types, or missing cases in some control flow scenarios before the code reaches production. Why does the Angular Style Guide matter? The Angular Style Guide promotes consistency across projects and teams. Following it makes code easier to navigate, review, refactor, and onboard onto, which is especially valuable in large codebases and multi-developer environments. What is the Angular Workspace file structure? An Angular workspace has a root configuration area and one or more projects beneath it. The structure supports CLI commands, project targets, source code organization, and shared workspace settings such as angular.json and TypeScript configuration files. What are custom elements in Angular? Angular can package components as standards-based custom elements using Angular Elements. This lets you expose Angular components as reusable web components that can be embedded outside a full Angular application. What is the difference between server-side rendering or SSR and pre-rendering/static side generation or SSG in Angular? Server-side rendering, or SSR, renders HTML on demand for incoming requests, while pre-rendering or static side generation, or SSG, generates pages ahead of time during the build. Server-side rendering, or SSR, is better for request-specific content and highly dynamic pages, while pre-rendering works well for content that can be produced in advance and served statically. What is the difference between route parameters and query parameters? Route parameters are part of the route path, such as /users/:ID, and usually identify a specific resource. Query parameters come after the question mark in the URL and are commonly used for filters, sorting, pagination, and optional state. Activated route can read both kinds of values. What is router link active used for? Router link active adds one or more CSS classes when a linked route is currently active. It is commonly used in navigation menus, so the UI can highlight the current page or section. What are extended diagnostics in Angular? Extended diagnostics are compiler checks that warn about Angular patterns that are technically valid but often lead to bugs or surprising behavior. They help teams catch issues earlier and enforce better template and framework usage during development. Wow, you have made it all the way to the end. We want to thank you for your time and wish you the very best in your studies. We hope you learned something from this video. Remember, do what you love and love what you do every day. We'll see you on the next video.